I'm clicking on record. I'm Jaya. I'm one of the co-founders of The Story Of, and I'd like to introduce Madhu. She has done her PhD and worked as a researcher in molecular and environmental plant science. And then she's done a master's in curriculum and instruction and social and leadership development. She's been a TEDx speaker twice, once on a talk in Ranchi of teaching with a difference, and another talk on arts-based learning. She was a part of the Story of Light Festival. So she's based in Hyderabad now since a few years. And she's been coaching a bunch of students. So usually sometimes if you're working with underprivileged children, it often happens that you work with them for 1 year or 2 years. But she's been working with one bunch of students for, I think, 6 or 7 years. I don't know, Madhu, you can correct me on this. And she and the students made an installation together for the Story of Light Festival called The Spectacle. And they repeated that installation 2 times.
Now again, he's the person, who's talking to me about a place that nobody has spoken about.
Oh no, my camera's on.
Oh yeah, and I'm muting you. And and I invited her to speak today to tell us a little bit more of what she's learned through this experience. And she uses art a lot in education. So she's made a little framework around that and to share a little bit more about that. So Madhu, is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, just that, typically I take a bunch of children and work with them for about 3-4 years. So we take children in 7th grade and then bridge them and let go of them once they're in 10th grade. So it's not more than 4 years.
So 4 years. Okay. So can you tell me first, as a researcher and then an educator, what prompted you to introduce and to use art so actively in education and learning?
Essentially, we teach as we learn. And how we learn is based on our lived experiences. And I've always learned through art. Learning through impersonal expression of art has been a great part of learning process from childhood. And let me show you what I mean by the impersonal expression of art. Is everybody able to see the slides?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So essentially, what impersonal expression of art is, in traditional societies all across the world, art always has been used to understand how people live in communes and communities. So typically celebrations, and community events, they are characterized by installations, they're characterized by reconstruction of lived experiences. This is very different from going to a museum and looking at a painting or sculpture. That would be personal expressions, because you're getting your subjectivity in and constructing and deconstructing. That is more related to thought, and this kind of art, impersonal expression, is more related to lived experience.
Okay, and what is the picture that we are seeing?
This is an installation. This is a very traditional installation all across South India during many festivals like Dasara, Diwali, Sankranti, where, themes are picked up and, the whole family or children or a group of adults and a group of children in the community or just one family reconstructs their lived experience about, like one theme. So here what you're seeing is Gardens of the World. So every year for the first 6 months, I work with children in a homeschool environment where children come to my home and my home becomes their school. So this year, for one of the festivals, we reconstructed the Gardens of the World, and through reconstructing Gardens of the World, we learned about different cultures, how the Japanese built their garden, how the Chinese built their gardens. Then, how are the gardens in Mediterranean areas, and what kind of food they eat. So every time we made a garden, like we were learning about a garden, we would try to visit a similar garden in and around the city and come back and make some food, dress up like the people in that culture would do. And in building the whole thing, I mean, children learned a lot of mathematics. They had to measure everything and things like that. And also a lot of creativity. I mean, here on the left side, you could see that they use the xylophone as stairs.
Nice.
So a lot of creativity. I mean, on the right side, you can see a waste bottle and a mosquito repellent turned into a lamp. So a lot of stuff like that.
Cool.
They learned about geology because they used a lot of, different rock materials. They learned about ecology, different types of ecology across the world. They learned a lot about botany, different types of plants. So that's how we kind of integrate a lot of learning. So this has been a very traditional practice. So I've grown up with this. And every year this would happen. And when I started the nonprofit, when I started working with the children, it was a natural transition for me to kind of get them engaged with similar activities, whether it was the festivals or whether we were reconstructing a lived experience. We were doing theater, linking it to science, math, or social studies, or language, literature. So, I mean, you name an art and we kind of incorporate it, and we try to keep it very local, so that it has meaning to their life, helps them understand, helps them interpret, construct around that art form, that craft form, and when they go home, they're able to make connections to their lives. So, which is why I use quite a bit of art, because it connects culture to environment, and also helps us engage in complicated conversations about how we normalize destruction of the environment, how we normalize destruction of culture, and back and forth, how we look at culture as environment and environment as culture.
And how do you go about choosing the topics that you want to focus on?
Typically, it all gets tied up. I mean, sometimes it's based on questions. Mostly it's based on questions that children bring up.
Yeah.
And then we start from that point. For example, when they were in ninth grade, they had to study a lot of European Renaissance, and that had no meaning to them whatsoever. They didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't know Michelangelo. They didn't know the Piety. They didn't know whatever, praying, folding hands. But then we said, okay, why don't we start looking at what happened in Kundapur, where you live, at about the same time? And they found a lot of Buddhist literature going on, Buddhist culture. So we said, let's study the Buddhist literature, the Buddhist culture, and then link it to Michelangelo. Let's see how similar or different that was. And how we linked it was through theater.
Okay.
So there were, children enacting piety, and some were enacting the Buddhist acts or the sculptures or the art forms they were seeing. And then a complicated conversation happens, and they all come to the conclusion that, similar things happen across the world during a period of time.
Yeah.
If there's strife all across. If there's prosperity all across. So just a small example of how we do it.
Okay. And with this spectacle in particular, what you did for Story of Light with the students, constructing the story of human civilization, can you tell a little bit more of how this came to be? Like what was your role? What was the role of the students in creating this experience?
So essentially, for me, while I was in the US, for like 10 years, and I used to play a lot of blacklight putt-putt, mini golf.
Okay.
Simply because two things.
Fun.
One, I used to, fun, and I used to feel static. You know, there's like a dragon or a dinosaur, and I got to put a ball into it, and it's going to come out of the tail. And in the process, I used to be able to do a lot of math. And right from childhood, I was never good at math. So I learned a lot of statistics going to the marketplace, which is when I realized that my sensory perception was different when the light changed. So for many years, I was trying to understand. I was actually looking for an opportunity where I could understand this much deeper, much further. And then, of course, I met Jaya, and we were talking about this. And then this idea struck me as to why don't we submit a proposal based on, using a different source of light than visible light. And this was about the time when, simultaneously the children were looking into a lot of history, geography, in connection to geographical distribution, as well as the ecology and botany. And suddenly one of them one day said, why do people keep calling us, like, why are we the East and why is somebody else the West? Who decided that we are East and they're West? And that is when some other child said, but if you're talking about a bias, how do we know that our books, our literature is not biased?
Yeah.
And then somebody else said, okay, we need to have a starting point where we start looking at things and reconstruct the whole story, whatever we choose, as how we understand it, because that's the only way. Experience is the only thing that can really make sense, because everything is just words. Everything else is words. Subjectivity of subjectivity of subjectivity. And then I suggested, why don't we do something with UV light, black lights? And a couple of them said, yeah, I know, detergent, you can put it under UV light. We did this experiment 3 months ago, you remember? Somebody else said toothpaste, and then somebody else said something else. And we put that proposal together and sent it to you, and it got approved, and we came there with the whole exhibit.
Okay, so the pictures you all are seeing here are different parts of the exhibit. They had a whole big room where they kind of had many mini stories going on, and in black light. And do you want to share some anecdotes of like visitor perceptions?
Sure, because especially the one you're seeing right now is pyramids, and all of them using origami by hand. So the children used origami, so they devised their own formulae, they devised whatever mathematics they needed to do to come up with these structures. And all of it has been done with origami. And a lot of visitors, I think, especially when we did it for the first time at the Story of Light, would just sleep on the floor. Like, they didn't want to go out. Then, they would express things like, I feel like I'm one with the universe. I feel like I'm part of something really big. I feel connected to everything. A lot of them didn't know what was going on, but they didn't want to leave the place. People were just, like sleeping on the floor, somebody said, I feel like I'm floating in space. Then
Nice.
somebody else would, kind of say, I'm, like, it's so nice. It seems like it's overwhelming, but it's not overwhelming. Feels really good inside. So those were a lot of things that people kept on saying. And then we came back to Hyderabad, and we kind of did it 2 more times. And in the process, we learned quite a bit about what was happening in that environment.
Nice. And you use this term sublime learning environment. Could you tell us a little bit more of what do you mean by sublime, and what are the different factors to consider in this, in creating
Sure.
a sublime environment? Yeah.
Sure. Essentially, the word sublime refers to extraordinary, or simply beyond sensory perception, something overwhelmingly beautiful, something that kind of elevates you a certain level. And when we used ultraviolet light, and I'm going to take this example so we get to the understanding of sensory perceptions using light, and then we can talk about what happens when we use different things. So what happened is that when we used ultraviolet light, there was overwhelming clarity in vision and perspective. And because of this, everybody started feeling that the experience is really authentic. The sensory overload that usually occurs, when we're seeing things in visible light was absent there. And secondly, there was a certain aesthetics, a certain ambience, and which led to the shift in visual perception, where typically in visible light, all of us are thinking things are happening around us.
Yeah.
But in this particular light, the observer really understood that the source of seeing is not external light, but themselves. So they could feel the experience happening inside them, which typically doesn't happen in visible light. We end up thinking it's happening outside. And let me explain that a little further. All of us have seen this before, like for us to be able to see something, the object reflects light, then it comes into a pupil, then there's an inverted image on the retina, then the brain kind of reverts it back to its original image. And so this is known. So essentially the experience is happening inside us because the inverted image is on our retina. It's not outside us. And this has been central to why people keep feeling, really good. Because typically the sensory overload, it cuts them off from understanding that the experience is within. Okay. And here that perception was phenomenally clear. Secondly, let me show you, this way. Secondly, what happens is whenever there is any kind of sensory stimulus, the sensory stimulus leads to a certain kind of emotion inside us. And when there is emotion, certain biochemical changes happen inside our biology. And as these biochemical changes happen, the brain triggers certain neural activity in relation to these biochemical changes. So, and this pattern of neural activity, if it is activated over a period of time, again and again and again, it causes conditioning, which is why when, I could see a lizard and be very scared because I felt that neural activity again and again and again. So this emotion that is, like as a result of this sensory stimulus is causing so many different things. So what happens when you change the sensory stimulus, like we did with the ultraviolet light? And we all know that UV light is high energy.
Yeah.
So the emotion was different than in visible light, which means the biochemical changes in the body were different. So was the neural activity, neural pattern, which is why they felt something good, different from what they feel all the time. And once we understood, we realized that the external environment can be used to condition our internal environment.
Yeah.
So we could start changing our classrooms. We could start changing our lifescapes, our learning environments in such a way that the conditioning that is happening due to learning, is much more sublime, much more, like it's extraordinary. It's phenomenal.
Okay. I must ask, do you all have any questions at this point before we move ahead? Does anybody have any questions so far for Madhu? Okay. So Madhu, you also wrote this up into a paper. where you outlined a framework. Could you share that framework with us?
Sure. Last month, I presented a paper at the International Conference of Contextual Aesthetics in Pedagogy, and this is the framework. So we have a filter, and typically this framework is used in art and design frequently. So I've used the basic framework that's used in art and art education and then developed on it. So in art and art education, the framework is form, content, and context. And if you speak to designers, they'll say form, space, and context, but it's about the same thing. So when we're talking about form, especially with respect to the story of light, we're looking at materials, all the materials that were used in building the installation. We're looking at the visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, sensory stimulus that we provided. And in our case, it was mostly visual with the story of light. But if this were a different installation, it could be auditory. If we're tasting something, like it could be gustatory. If there's movement involved, like theater, it would be tactile. The smell involved, that would be olfactory. So form, and especially form as in traditional Indian perspective also. It's called akar or akaram, and this has formed the basis of a lot of phenomenology, even in Indian traditional darshans. So this is a meeting point for the Western psychology-based philosophy and the traditional Indian beyond the construct of the mind kind of philosophy. Then the second aspect of the framework is context. Sanskrit, it's also called sandarbha, sandarbham. And these would be questions like, where did this happen? How did this happen? What caused this? What is the purpose of this? What kind of placement did we use in constructing what we've constructed? And what is the scope and sequence in the learning environment? And this essentially builds the story in any space. And together, form and context can be considered as an arrangement. They're like buddies.
Okay.
They go hand in hand. The second component is content. And typically, when we look at content, we look at content as in terms of something, a bunch of words or something that has been built or like a
story essentially.
Yeah, stories, narratives. But here, content is Vishay or Vishyam, meaning content here is not just a written word, but it is perception that is coming out of the connections that the observer's lived experience is making with the environment. So the clarity of vision, the understanding of self, a sense of being in that moment. That aha, what we call gestalt, that is happening. All that is happening within the observer is content here. And this content varies from person to person because everybody's perception is different.
Okay. So everybody's coming with their own story, and it's more about how their, what is it called? Their perception is matching or is relating to what they are seeing or what they're interacting with.
Exactly, because their lived experience is going to inform their perception.
Okay, so the term is lived experience. So if I'm coming with a set of preconditions or perceptions, that is my lived experience.
Correct. And then you come into this space and this sublime environment, you kind of lose a lot of that conditioning.
Okay, because
and
now it's a new situation.
New situation. You lose that old conditioning, and how you lose that old conditioning is also unique to you because everybody's conditioning is different.
Yeah.
So again, everybody's perceptions are going to be different, but as such, for an individual, it's a different perception.
Okay.
So, and there has to be a balance between the arrangement and the content, or the perception, because the arrangement was the form and context together, and the content is the perception. So the framework is that there has to be a balance between the arrangement and perception, meaning if the arrangement is too logical, extremely logical, and the perception is really low, then, you know, the functioning of the environment will be very good. But, you know, the experience is very mediocre. On the other hand, if the perception is really exceptional, the experience will be great, but the arrangement of the environment is in disarray. So whether it's a classroom, whether, you know, any other environment that you're trying to build or you work in, or if you start looking at it from this perspective of arrangement and perception, you'll start seeing that in natural environments, especially, I'll show a few pictures after a couple of slides.
Yeah.
You'll see that there's great balance between arrangement and perception in natural environments. Something that if we understand in great detail, then we are able to kind of, you know, incorporate that in our environments, in our learning experiences.
Okay.
Now, apart from looking at the form, content, and context, I'm currently doing a lot of work in understanding traditional Indian darshans, their experiences. And there's what we call darshans in Indian philosophy. And darshan refers to experience. So the lived experience that I was talking about. And according to Indian tradition, there's 5 koshas, or 5 layers in humans. The outermost layer is called Annamaya kosha, and it's associated with the element fire and the perception, the sensory stimulus of sight, perception of sight. Then the next kosha, the next layer is called Pranamaya kosha, and this is associated with the element air, or wind, and the sensory perception of touch. And Annamaya kosha and Pranamaya kosha are in an awakened state where the person is totally awake. These two are functioning in that state. Then comes the Manomaya kosha, and Manomaya kosha is associated to water, the element water, and taste. And Vijnanamaya kosha, the next one, is associated to earth and the sensory perception of smell. It's really difficult to separate Manomaya and Vijnanamaya. So when you cook, when you're eating also, it's very difficult for you to separate smell and taste.
Yeah, and I've heard that if you lose your sense of smell, you can't taste.
Exactly. And those people that don't have sensory perception in terms of buds on their tongues and stuff, they have issues with smelling too. So, and this state that exists, you know, a person, this state is kind of more like a dream, subconscious state, where, let's say, you're eating, but, you know, like, it's creating an experience for you that is different than when you're walking and running and doing things when you're really awake. Then the final kosha is called Anandamaya kosha, and this is associated to space, element space, and the sensory perception of sound. And this is a state which is deep sleep. So when people meditate, they essentially are possibly going into Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, touching Anandamaya for a while, coming out, or going into Anandamaya if they're like, if they have expertise in that, and staying there for a while. Anandamaya kind of gets you in touch with yourself. And this is basically what happened to people when they walked into the story of life. Without any effort, they reach their Anandamaya kosha.
It's also funny because for the story of space, we got a significant number of proposals that were related to sound. Yeah.
Definitely.
Like,
I would think so.
funny,
So
okay.
this has been the framework that I'm working on as of now. And the next part of the research and work is going to be on connection between emotions and levels of consciousness, because these are levels of consciousness. And how do we use these different elements and the different sensory perceptions and enhance consciousness within our spaces? We've done that with light. So now we want to kind of move on. And sound is the most profound, most, powerful sensory perception of all of them. I think that is something that I'm greatly interested in. But I think with story of space, we're going to touch everything.
Nice. Okay. So could you just kind of summarize maybe for us, what do we kind of have to do to make a sublime learning environment?
So you got to focus, because here when we're saying sublime learning environment, we've got to understand that the human body becomes one with the learning environment. Which is why it's really important that the external environments, which consist of form, context, and content, are related to internal experience. And how you create this relation between the internal and the external is through a balance of logic, like how we talked about, or rather intellectual subjectivity and heightened perception. And this heightened perception happens through awareness. And when you're able to create this balance between the external environment and the internal environment, using the balance of intellectual subjectivity and heightened perception, the environment is sublime. Now what I'll do is I'll show you a few pictures. They kind of depict this.
Yeah.
So these are a few pictures of forests in South India. I traveled to Calicut from Hyderabad. I drove. So I was able to drive through Bandipur, Mudumalai, Gudalur forests. And if you're looking at the images that I'm showing you, I'd ask you to kind of start looking at it from the perspective of arrangement and perception. How is everything arranged in nature? And how do you perceive it? I mean, look at it, phenomenal, right? I mean, the arrangement is just, this is sublime. Your senses, this experience is beyond your senses. Just like, you could be sitting on
A mountain.
Yeah. You could be sitting on, in a balcony and you're hearing like a motorbike tick, 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 go away. And the sound lingers with you even after the bike goes away.
Yeah.
Because the sound is in, the sound that you're hearing is in your consciousness now. It's not outside.
Yeah.
The sound happens inside. And something like that happens when you go into these natural environments, whether it's the trees, the mountains, the sky, the water, or the plants that are arranged around these water bodies, and the engagement of the arrangement with the perception it creates. Phenomenal balance. So
Nice.
essentially, that is what we've got to try to mimic in our learning environments. So that is how much I've found so far.
Nice. So I guess we'll use our last 5 to 10 minutes for some questions that any of you might have. You can feel free to unmute at this point. If anybody has any, like, what is some blah blah kosha?
Blah, blah, kosha.
Annamaya,
Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya,
Vijnanamaya, and Anandamaya.
All that is fine, but I think the listing of the
Can you hear anything, Jaya? Was there a question?
I think Nilanjana? No? Okay. Okay, maybe if nobody has any questions, what I'm going to do after this session is I'm going to be emailing a little summary sheet of what was spoken about today. And Madhu's on board also as a consultant with us for the story of space. So if any of you here are making something, you can feel free to write to her. Her email address will be inside the sheet that I'm mailing. And thank you for coming to our first webinar. And we'd also welcome any feedback.
Yeah, thank you all. It was really nice meeting everyone and a great experience.
And Zoom is good.
Yes, yes, really
Yeah.
good.
Cool. Thanks. Bye-bye and good night.
Okay, good night.
Bye, thank you.